Well, welcome to Marking the End Times. I'm Mark Hitchcock, and as you know from the last couple of weeks from our videos, my wife Cheryl and I have been in Egypt for the last couple of weeks, and hope you enjoyed the videos that we brought you from there. I'd like to have done more of those, but we got done what we could do during that time. Really enjoyed bringing those to you, and it was a great trip. We saw all kinds of things. Hopefully I'll be able to talk more about some of these things. In fact, as we get to the subscriber only section here in a little bit, I'll answer a question that's about Egypt and so in prophecy. So that'll be a great question for us to answer. But it's always good to be home. We're back home here and back in our usual familiar surroundings for the video this week. And on today's video, what I want to do is talk about growing concern in the world today over food shortages. And even in Europe, which is a well-fed continent, there's growing concerns there about future food shortages that could spill over into a global crisis. And when I look at this and what we're going to talk about here today, this is really a striking preview or precursor or a foreshadow of the black horse in Revelation chapter 6, the third horseman of those four horsemen of the apocalypse. So that's what I want to focus on in today's video. Now, before we do that, let me just mention that in a bit, we'll go to the subscriber only section. And a few questions I want to answer here. One is, if Satan is bound for 1,000 years, will there still be sin on the earth? Isn't Satan the cause of sin? I understand we all have free will, but once Christ comes back to rule the earth, isn't sin also bound? So talk about sin during the 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. Another question is, in the New Testament, Matthew is also referred to as Levi. Did Jesus change his name like he did Simon Peter? And then another question, as I mentioned, a great question about Egypt and prophecy. It says in Ezekiel 29, there's a prophecy against Egypt. I know Nebuchadnezzar came in and plundered and took over, but I've never read that Egypt was desolate for 40 years. Did this happen, or is this a future prophecy? So we'll talk about that, and actually another prophecy in Ezekiel 29 that we still see being fulfilled even today. So we'll talk about those in a bit when we get to that subscriber only section. But there was an article not long ago in Bloomberg, and the headline says, Europe's new security nightmare is food supply. It says there's a growing level of anxiety about securing supplies. And in a kind of a very similar article, a parallel article in the Business Standard, I want to just read a few quotes from this article. It says the combined forces of El Nino and La Nina have crippled Latin American soy output. Ukrainian and Russian grain farmers have gone to war. Indonesia has banned shipments of palm oil to Europe, while China is hungry for crops. The Mediterranean region is getting more like a desert. Food shortage in Europe. The only question is when. Now, this article is not saying all those things are happening now, but these are things that are forecast that could happen in the future, that could lead to this global food crisis. So the Business Standard article goes on and says this: over 2 days in central Brussels last month, some 60 European Union and government officials, food security experts, industry representatives, and a few journalists gathered to confront the possibility of something barely on the radar a few years ago, a full-blown food crisis. So what they did is they gathered to kind of stress test the system, the food distribution system and production, especially in Europe. So this was called a wargaming exercise for a full-blown food crisis. So rather than kind of wargaming for battle and conflict, it was wargaming for a food crisis. And the article goes on to say this: the coronavirus pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and disruptions on key shipping routes have disturbed supply chains and sent prices soaring. Erratic and extreme weather now regularly disturbs farming. Against that backdrop, officials are no longer asking when a food crisis may arrive, but rather how many crises can they deal with at once. And then it says, in truth, few governments in Europe are prepared for managing future food crises. According to Chris Hagedorn, a retired U.S. diplomat who organized this workshop, says, we've been living in crisis for the last 3 years. He says there's a lot more to be done at every level. Crises are only going to come faster and harder. So they're concerned about food shortages in Europe. Now, what they're concerned is that what's happened in some other countries in the world will spread there. Just think about this for a moment. In Nigeria, household spending on food in Nigeria is 60%. They spend 60% of their household income on food. In Egypt, is where my wife and I have just been the last couple of weeks, it's 40%. And so there's a fear that this kind of food shortage and calamity will spread to different parts of the world. Now, when I read things like that, my mind immediately goes to Revelation chapter 6, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And what we see here, I think, is just kind of a faint foreshadow of what the Bible says is coming. In Revelation chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, we read this. And he broke the third seal. Now, the he there is the Lamb. This is the Lord Jesus who's breaking these 7 seals on this scroll. And that's one of the reasons why I believe that the rapture will happen before these seals are opened, because these seals are being opened by Jesus. So these seals are his wrath that he's bringing on the earth. And the Bible tells us we're exempt from wrath. So he breaks the third seal. I heard the living creature saying, "Come." I looked and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the 4 living creatures. Probably this is the voice here of God the Father, saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine." What this speaks of here is hyperinflation, and primarily the idea of famine. So, well, how do we know this talks about famine? Well, first of all, we know that famine often follows war. And if you think about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the first horseman is a rider on a white horse. That pictures the coming false Messiah, the Antichrist. You know, Jesus rides on a white horse in Revelation chapter 19 as he comes back to take his kingdom and take control of the earth. But here in Revelation 6, we have a rider on a white horse who's a false Messiah. And we know that the second rider is the rider on the red horse. And he has a sword that's dripping with blood. And so that pictures warfare. The horse is red. It's pyros, the color of fire. And we know that famine often follows warfare. In fact, a lot of the famine we're seeing in the world today and food shortages is because of the Russia-Ukraine war. Because Ukraine's a large producer of wheat and grain. We see the same thing in Haiti. As there's war down there and chaos, we see famine. We see the same thing in Gaza today. So you have the white horse, followed by the red horse of war, then followed by the black horse of famine. Another reason we know this is famine or food shortage is this is a parallel to Matthew 24. In Revelation chapter 6, the seal judgments parallel what we have in Matthew 24 when Jesus lays out the birth pains that will signal his coming in the end. Remember in Matthew 24, you have false messiahs and false Christs. In Revelation 6, you have the rider on the white horse. Then you have wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. That's the rider on the red horse in Revelation chapter 6. Then the next thing in Matthew 24 is there will be famines in various places. And so the same order there, we have this rider on this black horse. And then finally, the rider holds a pair of scales in his hand. So he's weighing out food here on the scales. So what we have here is the haunting phantom of famine. And along with that, we have runaway inflation. So astronomical food prices. So it'll take all the money that someone has. It says a quart of wheat for a denarius. A denarius in that day was the average day's wages for a worker. So it's saying that you can buy 1 quart of wheat, which would be the better kind of food, or 3 quarts of barley, which would be the cheaper food. So it's going to take everything a person can earn in a day to buy good food for 1 person or cheaper food for 3 people. So the prices listed here in Revelation 6 are 8 to 16 times the average prices that they were back in the Roman Empire when John wrote this. John Walvoord, a great Bible teacher, great prophecy teacher, he says this: To put it in ordinary language, the situation would be such that one would have to spend a day's wages for a loaf of bread with no money left to buy anything else. The symbolism therefore indicates a time of famine when life will be reduced to the barest necessities. But then notice that last phrase says, but do not damage the oil and the wine. Oil and wine in that day were more luxury items. So what it's saying here is that it's going to be a gripping famine for those who don't have much, but for the wealthy, they're going to go relatively unaffected. So the gulf between the rich and the poor will grow even wider and wider during this period of time in the future. Now, I believe Revelation chapter 6 occurs after the rapture takes place. And that's good news for us. I think the rapture of the church is going to take place, and then these seals will be opened, and then the seventh seal contains 7 trumpets, and the 7th trumpet will contain the 7 bowls. But as we look around our world, we can already hear the thundering hoofbeats of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in the distance. And we can hear them growing closer and closer. We see our world stage ready for the rise of the Antichrist. We see wars and rumors of wars today. It just seems like it's getting harder and harder to keep the lid on this world before it blows up and war breaks out all over the world. And then, of course, what will come from that then is this famine and runaway inflation that's going to grip the entire world. And again, we see the foreshadows of that in our world today. We're getting a little inkling of that with the inflation we see today and with the fear of these food shortages. So the good news, though, for us today is we're going to be caught away to heaven, the bride of Jesus Christ, before the wrath of God comes in these sealed judgments. But the fact that we can already hear the approaching hoofbeats tells us that the rapture of the church may be very soon. Well, let's go now to this subscriber-only section again, and we'll answer these questions that I mentioned earlier. And if you're not a subscriber, you can go to endtimes.com and sign up there just for $7 a month. And I think you'll be really glad that you've done that. It'll be a great blessing, I think, to you as we live in these increasingly complex times in which we find ourselves. So let's go now to the subscriber-only section. We'll answer these questions.